The Rhetorical Situation by Lloyd F. Bitzer. If someone says that is a dangerous situation, his words suggest the presence of events, persons, or objects which threaten him, someone else, or something of value. If someone remarks, I find myself in an embarrassing situation, again, the statement implies certain situation characteristics. If someone remarks that he found himself in an ethical situation, we understand that he probably either contemplated or made some choice of action from a sense of duty or obligation, or with a view to the good. In other words, there are circumstances of this or that kind of structure which are recognized as ethical, dangerous, or embarrassing. What characteristics, then, are implied when one refers to the rhetorical situation? The context in which speakers or writers create rhetorical discourse. Perhaps this question is puzzling because situation is not a standard term in the vocabulary of rhetorical theory. Audience is standard, so also are speaker, subject, occasion, and speech. If I were to ask, what is a rhetorical audience, or what is a rhetorical subject, the reader would catch the meaning of my question. When I ask, what is a rhetorical situation, I want to know the nature of those contexts in which speakers or writers create rhetorical discourse. How should they be described? What are their characteristics? Why and how do they result in the creation of rhetoric? By analogy, a theorist of science might well ask, what are the characteristics of situations which inspire scientific thought? A philosopher might ask, what is the nature of the situation in which a philosopher does philosophy? And a theorist of poetry might ask, how shall we describe the context in which poetry comes into existence? The presence of rhetorical discourse obviously indicates the presence of a rhetorical situation. The Declaration of Independence, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, Churchill's address on Dunkirk, John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. Each is a clear instance of rhetoric, and each indicates the presence of a situation. While the existence of a rhetorical address is a reliable sign of the existence of a situation, it does not follow that a situation exists only when the discourse exists. Each reader probably can recall a specific time and place when there was opportunity to speak on some urgent matter, and after that opportunity was gone, he created in private thought the speech he should have uttered earlier in the situation. It is clear that situations are not always accompanied by discourse, nor should we assume that a rhetorical address gives existence to the situation. On the contrary, it is a situation which calls the discourse into existence. Clement Attlee once said that Winston Churchill went around looking for finest hours. The point to observe is that Churchill found them, the crisis situations, and spoke in response to them. No major theorist has treated rhetorical situations thoroughly as a distinct subject in rhetorical theory. Many ignore it. Those rhetoricians who discuss situations do so indirectly, as does Aristotle, for instance, who is led to consider situations when he treats types of discourse. None, to my knowledge, has asked the nature of rhetorical situation. Instead, rhetoricians have asked, what is the purpose by which the orator creates and presents discourse? What is the nature of rhetorical discourse? What sorts of interactions occur between speaker, audience, subject, and occasion? Typically, the question which triggers theories of rhetorical focus upon the orator's method or upon the discourse itself rather than upon the situation, which invites the orator's application of his method and the creation of discourse. Thus, rhetoricians distinguish among and characterize the types of speeches: forensic, deliberative, epidemic. They treat issues, types of proofs, lines of argument, strategies of ethical and emotional persuasion, the parts of a discourse and the function of those parts, qualities of style, figures of speech. They cover approximately the same materials, the formal aspect of rhetorical method, and discourse, whether focusing upon method, product, or process. While conceptions of situations are implicit in some theories of the rhetoric, none explicitly treat the formal aspects of situation. I hope that enough has been said to show that the question, what is a rhetorical situation, is not an idle one. I propose in what follows to set forth part of a theory of situation. This essay, therefore, should be understood as an attempt to revive the notion of rhetorical situation, to provide at least the outline of an adequate conception of it, and to establish it as a controlling and fundamental concern of rhetorical theory. Part 1. It seems clear that rhetoric is situational. In saying this, I do not mean merely that understanding a speech hinges upon understanding the context of meaning in which the speech is located. Virtually no utterance is fully intelligible unless meaning, context, and utterance are understood. This is true of rhetorical and non-rhetorical discourse. Meaning context is a general condition of human communication and is not synonymous with rhetorical situation. Nor do I mean merely that rhetoric occurs in a setting which involves interaction of speaker, audience, subject, and communicative purpose. This is too general, since many types of utterances, philosophical, scientific, poetic, and rhetorical, occur in such settings. Nor would I equate rhetorical situations with persuasive situations which exist whenever an audience can be changed in belief or action by means of a speech. Every audience at any moment is capable of being changed in some way by speech. Persuasive situations is altogether general. Finally, I do not mean that a rhetorical discourse must be embedded in historic context in the sense that a living tree must be rooted in soil. A tree does not obtain its characteristic as tree from the soil, but rhetorical discourse, I shall argue, does obtain its character as rhetorical from the situation which generates it. Rhetorical works belong to the class of things which obtain their character from the circumstances of the historical context in which they occur. A rhetorical work is analogous to a moral action rather than to a tree. An act is moral because it is an act performed in a situation of a certain kind. Similarly, a work is rhetorical because it is a response to a situation of a certain kind. In order to clarify rhetoric as essentially related to situation, we should acknowledge a viewpoint that is commonplace but fundamental. A work of rhetoric is pragmatic. It comes into existence for the sake of something beyond itself. It functions ultimately to produce action or change in the world. It performs some task. In short, rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, not by the direct application of energy to objects, but by the creation of discourse which changes reality through the mediation of thought and action. The rhetor alters out reality by bringing into existence a discourse of such a character that the audience in thought and action is so engaged that it becomes a mediator of change. In this sense, rhetoric is always persuasive. To say that rhetorical discourse comes into being in order to effect change is altogether general. We need to understand that a particular discourse comes into existence because of some specific condition or situation which invites utterance. Bronislaw Malinowski refers to just this sort of situation in his discussion of primitive language, which he finds to be essentially pragmatic and embedded in situation. He describes a party of fishermen in the Trobriand Islands whose functional speech occurs in a context of situation. The canoes glide slowly and noiselessly, punted by men especially good at this task, and always used for it. Other experts who know the bottom of the lagoon are on the lookout for fish. Customary signs or sounds or words are uttered. Sometimes a sentence full of technical reference to the channels or patches on the lagoon has to be spoken. Sometimes a conventional cry is uttered. Again, a word of command is passed here and there, a technical expression or explanation which serves to harmonize their behavior toward other men. An animated scene full of movement follows, and now that the fish are in their power, the fishermen speak loudly and give vent to their feelings. Short, telling exclamations fly about, which might be rendered by such words as pull in, let go, shift further, lift the net. In this whole scene, each utterance is essentially bound up with the context of situation and with the aim of the pursuit. The structure of all this linguistic material is inextricably mixed up with, and dependent upon the course of the activity in which the utterances are embedded. Later, the observer remarks, in its primitive use, language functions as a link in concerted human activity, as a piece of human behavior. It is a mode of action and not an instrument of reflection. These statements about primitive language and the context of situation provide for us a preliminary model of rhetorical situation. Let us regard rhetorical situation as a natural context of persons, events, objects, relations, and an exigence which strongly invites utterance. This is invited utterance participates naturally in the situation, is in many instances necessary to the completion of situational activity, and by means of its participation with situations obtained its meaning and its rhetorical character. In Malinowski's example, the situation is the fishing expedition, consisting of objects, persons, events, and relations, and the ruling exigence, the success of the hunt. The situation dictates the sorts of observations to be made. It dictates the significant physical and verbal responses, and we must admit it constrains the words which are uttered in the same sense that it constrains the physical acts of paddling the canoe and throwing the nets. The verbal responses to the demands imposed by this situation are clearly as functional and necessary as the physical responses. Traditional theories of rhetoric have dealt, of course, not with the sort of primitive utterance described by Malinowski, stop here, throw the net, move closer, but with larger units of speech which comes more readily under the guidance of artistic principle and method. The difference between oratory and primitive utterance, however, is not a difference in function. The clear instance of rhetorical discourse and the fisherman's utterances are similar functional and similar situational. Observing both the traditions of the expedition and the facts before them, the leader of the fishermen finds himself obliged to speak at a given moment, to command, to supply information, to praise or blame, to respond appropriately to the situation. Clearly, instances of artistic rhetoric exhibit the same character. Cicero's speech against Catiline were called forth by a specific union of persons, events, objects, and relations, and by an exigence which amounted to an imperative stimulus. The speeches in the Senate Rotunda 3 days after the assassination of the President of the United States were actually required by the situation, so controlling its situation that we should consider it in the very grounds of rhetoric activity, whether that activity is primitive and productive of a simple utterance or artistic and productive of the Gettysburg Address. Hence, to say that rhetoric is situational means, number one, rhetorical discourse comes into existence as a response to situations in the same sense that an answer comes into existence in response to the question or a solution in response to a problem. Or number two, a speech is given rhetorical significance by the situation, just as a unit of discourse is given significance as answers are, or as solutions by, the question or problem. 3. A rhetorical situation must exist as a necessary condition of rhetorical discourse, just as a question must exist as a necessary condition of an answer. 4. Many questions go unanswered and many problems remain unsolved. Similarly, many rhetorical situations mature and decay without giving birth to a rhetorical utterance. 5. A situation is rhetorical insofar as it needs and invites discourse capable of participating with situation and thereby altering its reality. 6. Discourse is rhetorical insofar as it functions or seeks to function as a fitting response to a situation which needs and invites it. 7. Finally, the situation controls the rhetorical response in the same sense that the question controls the answer and the problem controls the solution. Not the rhetor and not persuasive intent, but the situation is the source and ground of rhetorical activity, and I should add, of rhetorical criticism.